The November fog that shrouded London on that particular Sunday morning seemed to muffle not merely the sounds of the great city, but the very passage of time itself. From our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, I could barely discern the gas lamps flickering through the grey veil that had settled upon the metropolis during the early hours. The church bells of Marylebone tolled with a mournful quality, their bronze voices deadened by the thick, yellow atmosphere that only our capital can produce with such oppressive thoroughness. Holmes had for once yielded to the contemplative spirit of the Sabbath. He lay at full length upon the sofa, his lean frame extended with that peculiar grace which marked even his moments of repose. His keen grey eyes were half closed, and his long, delicate fingers held a well-thumbed volume of German poetry. The morning papers lay scattered beside him in studied disorder, while his pipe rested cold in the ashtray, a sure sign that his mind was occupied with weightier matters than the day's news. "I observe, Watson," said he suddenly, without lifting his gaze from the page, "that you have abandoned all pretence of reading that medical journal and are instead cataloguing the various ailments of our neighbours by the sound of their footsteps upon the pavement below." I started slightly, for indeed I had found my attention wandering from Dr. Thornton's treatise on tropical diseases to the muffled sounds of the street. "How on earth did you deduce that, Holmes?" "Elementary, my dear fellow. Your journal has remained open to the same page for the past quarter hour. Yet your head has turned toward the window no fewer than 6 times. The bells ceased their calling some minutes ago, and the irregular pattern of footfalls suggests the post-service exodus from St. Bartholomew's. Given your medical training, it would be natural for you to note the hesitant gait of the elderly Mrs. Pemberton. Her arthritis troubles her more in this damp weather, and the hurried step of young Jameson, whose consumption grows worse with each passing week. Before I could respond to this typical display of Holmes's observational prowess, the familiar tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stairs reached our ears, accompanied by a lighter, more hesitant footfall. "A visitor," murmured Holmes, setting aside his book with sudden interest. "A lady, if I mistake not, and one who has been standing in our street for some considerable time, debating whether to mount our steps. Note the irregularity in her approach. That is the gait of someone whose natural composure has been shaken by circumstances beyond her control." Mrs. Hudson's gentle rap upon the door confirmed his observation. "Come," called Holmes, rising with that swift, bird-like movement which characterized his transition from languor to alertness. Our landlady entered, her kindly face bearing an expression of genuine concern. "Mr. Holmes, sir, there's a lady to see you. She gave no card, but she seemed that distressed, I thought—" "You did perfectly, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes interrupted with a courteous nod. "Pray show the lady in." Our visitor proved to be a woman of perhaps 30 years, though worry had etched premature lines about her dark eyes. Her dress, while of excellent quality, bore the telltale signs of hasty travel, and her gloved hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small reticule. Most telling of all was the faint aroma of river water and autumn leaves that seemed to cling to her dark travelling cloak. "Pray be seated, madam," said Holmes, indicating the chair he reserved for clients. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, whose discretion you may rely upon absolutely. You are cold and fatigued, I perceive. Mrs. Hudson, perhaps some tea?" "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," the lady replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fear I have come to you in great haste and without proper introduction. I am Mrs. Eleanor Marsh of Willowbank House near Chislehurst." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed? The soil upon your boots suggests the red clay common to that district, and the willow catkin caught in your veil speaks of a riverside residence. Your journey this morning was undertaken in considerable urgency. The morning train from Chislehurst, if I am not mistaken." Mrs. Marsh stared at him in amazement. "How could you possibly know such things?" "Observation and inference, madam, nothing more. But pray, tell us what has brought you to Baker Street on so inclement a morning. I perceive that you are in considerable distress." The lady drew a shuddering breath. "It concerns my husband, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Arthur Marsh. He disappeared 6 days ago under the most extraordinary circumstances, and I fear something terrible has befallen him." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Disappeared, you say? Pray give us the particulars." "Arthur is a cashier with the banking firm of Fife and Marbury in the city," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "A man of the highest character and most regular habits. Last Monday he left for his office as usual, but he never arrived. When I made inquiries, I learned that he had not been seen at the bank for several days. The police, Inspector Gregson, has been most kind, but they suspect—" Her voice faltered. "They suspect what, Mrs. Marsh?" I prompted gently. "That Arthur has absconded with funds from the bank. There have been irregularities discovered in certain accounts, substantial sums that cannot be accounted for. But, Mr. Holmes, I would stake my life upon my husband's honesty. He would no more steal than he would commit murder." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And yet men have been known to act against their nature when pressed by circumstances. Tell me, had your husband seemed troubled of late? Any unusual visitors, correspondence, or changes in his routine?" Mrs. Marsh hesitated. "There was one thing, Mr. Holmes, for the past fortnight. Arthur had been troubled by strange sounds at night. He said he could hear whispering among the willow trees that line our property by the river. At first I thought it merely the wind, but Arthur swore he could distinguish words. Warnings, he said, though he could never make out their meaning clearly. "Whispering willows," Holmes murmured, his eyes taking on that peculiar intensity I knew so well. "How very interesting. And these nocturnal communications? Did you hear them yourself?" "Only once, Mr. Holmes, on the night before Arthur disappeared. I was awakened by what seemed to be voices outside our bedroom window. When I looked out, I saw a dark figure moving among the trees by the riverbank. Arthur was deeply agitated and insisted we must leave Willowbank House immediately. But when morning came, he seemed to have reconsidered, and he went to the city as usual. That was the last time I saw him." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing. "Mrs. Marsh, you mentioned irregularities at the bank. Do you know which accounts were affected?" "Only one, I believe, that of Lord Chetwynd of Chetwynd Place." Arthur had spoken of his lordship before, describing him as a difficult but valuable client. "Ah," said Holmes, pausing in his stride, "Lord Chetwynd, a most interesting connection indeed." He turned to face our client. "Mrs. Marsh, Dr. Watson and I shall take your case. Return to Willowbank House and maintain your normal routine. Say nothing to anyone of your visit here. We shall join you tomorrow as old friends come to offer comfort in your time of trial." As Mrs. Marsh departed with expressions of gratitude and renewed hope, Holmes remained standing by the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. "Well, Holmes?" I asked. "What do you make of it?" He turned, his hawk-like features sharp with interest. "My dear Watson, we have before us a case of unusual complexity. A missing banker, mysterious nocturnal warnings, and a noble client whose affairs have become entangled in the web. The willows of Willowbank House whisper secrets, it would seem, and tomorrow we shall discover whether their message is one of warning or of guilt." The fog pressed against our windows like a living thing, and I could not shake the feeling that we were about to embark upon one of our most challenging adventures yet. The following morning brought little improvement in London's perpetual November gloom, though the fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the grimy facades of the city's endless terraces. Holmes had risen early, and I discovered him at breakfast, fully dressed and examining several telegrams with evident satisfaction. The morning papers lay scattered beside his plate, annotated with his characteristic marginal notes. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "I trust you slept well. We have a journey ahead of us, and I suspect our sojourn in the countryside may prove more eventful than our client anticipates." "You've been busy already this morning," I observed, noting the scattered correspondence upon the table. "Indeed, a few telegrams to old acquaintances have yielded some most illuminating intelligence regarding our mysterious Lord Chetwynd. It appears his lordship's financial affairs are considerably more complex than one might expect from a country nobleman." Holmes folded the message and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "But before we depart, Watson, allow me to demonstrate a point about the importance of observation in our work." He gestured toward the doorway. "Tell me, what have you observed about our good Mrs. Hudson this morning?" I considered for a moment. "Why, only that she seemed rather concerned for Mrs. Marsh yesterday, and appeared to be in her usual excellent spirits." Holmes chuckled softly. "You failed to notice, my dear fellow, the faint but distinct aroma of turpentine that clung to her apron, or the minute flecks of sawdust upon her sleeve. Nor did you remark upon the slight strain in her right shoulder, or the small, freshly painted chip on the corner of our mantelpiece." I looked around the room, then back at him, utterly bewildered. "Our estimable landlady," Holmes continued, "finding herself with a rare Sunday morning free from our immediate demands, decided to undertake a minor repair project. The turpentine suggests she cleaned the chipped area thoroughly, the sawdust indicates she filled it with wood putty, and the shoulder strain points to the awkward angle required for the work. It is merely the application of method, Watson. Every detail, however small, is a thread in the tapestry. And how does this relate to our current case? Precisely so. In Mrs. Marsh's situation, we have a tapestry woven with threads of financial malfeasance, domestic distress, and spectral whispers. Consider the inconsistencies. Why would a man of unblemished character choose such a transparent method of absconding? Why leave behind a wife who believes him innocent, only for irregularities to be discovered days after his departure? The obvious conclusion is precisely what our adversary expects us to reach. As we rattled toward Chislehurst on the 10:15 from Charing Cross, Holmes sat opposite me, his keen eyes half closed in thought. The rows of dingy brick gradually gave way to small villas and patches of autumnal woodland, their bare branches etched against the pale sky. "You anticipate that the grounds will furnish us with clues?" I asked. "Where else should one look for whispering willows? Human crime, however ingenious, must always leave its impress upon the material world. Our task is merely to read that impress correctly." Willowbank House stood in a bend of the River Cray, its Georgian facade partially screened by the drooping branches that gave the property its name. The willows formed an almost ethereal barrier between house and water, their pale trunks creating ghostly sentinels in the afternoon light. Mrs. Marsh received us with evident relief, and Holmes wasted no time in his examination. In the study, his eyes flickered rapidly over every surface. "You will observe, Watson," he murmured, bending low over the writing desk, "the faintest impression of a rectangle here, slightly darker than the surrounding area. Something lay upon this desk for some time and has recently been removed. A blotting book, perhaps? Or a portfolio? More significantly, the tin box Mrs. Marsh mentioned, containing her husband's army papers and family letters, has vanished from the top drawer." In the bedroom, Holmes noted the husband's clothes, all neatly arranged. A man who intends to flee with stolen funds does not usually leave behind his second-best suit, nor does he depart without so much as a shaving kit. It was at the riverside that Holmes's manner showed marked animation. Near the clump of reeds where Mrs. Marsh had seen the dark figure, he knelt suddenly, parting the grass with his fingers. "Footprints, Watson? 2 sets, one heavier, one lighter, both recent, and the soil has preserved their outline admirably." He traced the impressions along the bank, then halted at a faint depression near the water's edge. And here we have something yet more suggestive. A narrow groove leading directly into the river, as though some oblong object had been dragged or lowered. Note the rust stains along the stones. Through seemingly casual conversation with the servants, Holmes learned that Lord Chetwynd had been seen frequently on the river of late, accompanied by what the groundskeeper described as gentry types, keeping odd hours. As evening shadows gathered among the willows, Holmes positioned himself at our guest-room window, his hawk-like features sharp with anticipation. The willows may whisper, Watson, but the earth speaks more plainly. We are not dealing with mere domestic melodrama, but with design, deliberate, calculated design. The morning light, though still filtered through November's persistent gloom, afforded Holmes the opportunity for a more thorough examination of the riverbank. He spent the better part of the forenoon in meticulous study of every depression in the soft earth, every disturbance among the reeds, his keen eyes missing nothing that might illuminate the mystery of Arthur Marsh's disappearance. "Observe, Watson," he said, kneeling beside the faint groove we had noted the previous day. "These rust stains are not the product of general weathering. Note the distinct pattern, as if a metal object with several protruding points had rested here for some considerable time before being removed. The corrosion is fresh, not deeply embedded in the stone." I watched as he traced the depression with his finger. "You believe something was dragged from the water rather than into it?" "Precisely. And here," he indicated a cluster of disturbed reeds, "the impression of a boot much larger than Marsh's, pressing down with considerable force. Our missing banker was not alone during his final visit to this spot, and whatever transpired here involved the retrieval of some heavy object from the riverbed." Holmes's attention was drawn to a series of footprints that told their own story. Marsh's familiar gate led directly to the water's edge, but alongside ran another set, larger, with a peculiar heel mark, and showing curious hesitation at one point, as if the wearer had paused to observe the house before continuing. "The larger prints suggest a man of substantial build," Holmes mused, "yet note the careful placement of each step. This is not the careless tread of a country labourer, but the measured gait of one accustomed to moving with purpose and discretion." Our investigation was interrupted by Mrs. Marsh's appearance at the garden gate, her face bearing an expression of fresh distress. In her trembling hands she carried a folded paper. "Gentlemen, I have received what purports to be a communication from Arthur," she said, her voice barely steady. "Yet something about it troubles me deeply." Holmes examined the missive with his characteristic thoroughness, holding it to the light and studying both paper and ink with minute attention. The message was brief. "My dearest Eleanor, circumstances force me to remain away longer than anticipated. Do not attempt to follow or make inquiries. Trust that all will be explained in due course. Destroy this letter immediately. Your devoted husband, Arthur." "The handwriting bears a superficial resemblance to your husband's script," Holmes observed, "but note the pressure variations and the slight tremor in certain letter formations. This was written by someone attempting imitation, but betrayed by unfamiliarity with Mr. Marsh's natural rhythm." Mrs. Marsh nodded with growing conviction. "Arthur always concludes his letters to me with a particular phrase from our courtship days. 'Your devoted A.M., who counts the hours. No genuine communication from my husband would lack such authentication. Excellent, Mrs. Marsh. Your intimate knowledge of your husband's habits provides us with evidence no forger could anticipate. Holmes folded the letter carefully. This crude deception confirms that we are dealing with individuals who possess both cunning and resources, yet have made the crucial error of underestimating a wife's devotion. That evening, as Holmes and I maintained our vigil from the bedroom window, the mysterious whispering that had so disturbed Arthur Marsh finally revealed its true nature. Near midnight, faint voices drifted from the direction of the willows, not the random susurration of wind through leaves, but deliberate human communication. Through the drooping branches, I glimpsed the reflection of a shuttered lantern moving slowly along the water. Two dark figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible against the pale willow trunks. Holmes slipped from the room with cat-like stealth, returning 20 minutes later with eyes bright with discovery. "Our nocturnal visitors are indeed flesh and blood," he whispered. "I heard enough to confirm that Arthur Marsh's disappearance is merely one thread in a considerably larger web. They spoke of accounts, transfers, and what they termed the banker's inconvenient scruples. Most significantly, they mentioned tomorrow evening's meeting at Chetwynd Place. Meanwhile, the local constabulary had reached their own conclusions. Sergeant Davies, a jovial but unimaginative man, declared the case open and shut. Marsh had absconded with Lord Chetwynd's funds, with his lordship himself reporting the discrepancies. "Too neat, Watson," Holmes murmured as we reviewed the official theory. "The most artful deceptions are those that mimic simplicity. Our task is to distinguish between genuine evidence and carefully planted misdirection." As the willows swayed in the night breeze, their whispered secrets seemed closer to revelation than ever before. The morning brought an unexpected development in the form of Lord Chetwynd himself, whose imposing figure descended from a magnificent brougham drawn by matched bays. His lordship's arrival at Willowbank House carried all the ceremony befitting his station, yet Holmes, observing from the morning-room window, noted with characteristic precision the subtle signs of a man labouring under considerable strain. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured as we watched the nobleman's approach, "the careful adjustment of his cravat, a nervous habit, and the way he favours his left leg slightly. Note also the fresh scratches across his knuckles, and the peculiar reddish clay adhering to his otherwise immaculate boots. Our noble visitor has been engaged in activities that required him to venture off well-maintained paths." Lord Chetwynd proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, with prematurely silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that spoke of both intelligence and determination. His manner toward Mrs. Marsh was appropriately sympathetic, yet I detected an underlying tension that suggested his visit served purposes beyond mere courtesy. "My dear Mrs. Marsh," his lordship began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of privilege, "I felt compelled to call personally, given the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your husband's difficulties. I want to assure you that I bear no personal animosity toward Mr. Marsh, despite the irregularities in my account." Holmes had positioned himself where he could observe the conversation while appearing to examine Mrs. Marsh's collection of botanical prints. I noticed his particular attention to Lord Chetwynd's hands and bearing, cataloguing details with the methodical precision that marked his finest investigations. "Your lordship is most gracious," Mrs. Marsh replied with dignity, "though I maintain absolute faith in my husband's integrity. There must be some explanation for these supposed irregularities that does not impugn Arthur's character." A fleeting hardness crossed Lord Chetwynd's features before being replaced by practised sympathy. "Of course, my dear lady," One hopes that Mr. Marsh will soon return to explain these matters himself. In the meantime, I have instructed my solicitor to ensure that you are not held responsible for any financial complications that may arise. After his lordship's departure, Holmes immediately examined the areas where their visitor had stood. "Most instructive," he observed, kneeling beside the morning-room carpet. "The clay upon his boots is indeed distinctive, reddish, with flecks of a darker mineral I do not immediately recognize, certainly not from the chalk downs of Chetwynd Place." Our investigation was soon interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Gregson, whose ruddy features bore an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. The inspector's news promised to advance the case considerably, though in directions that would prove more complex than initially apparent. "I must inform you, Mrs. Marsh," Gregson announced with professional gravity, "that we have discovered additional evidence. A carpet bag containing nearly £300 in banknotes was found this morning in a left luggage office at Victoria Station. The claim ticket bears your husband's handwriting." Mrs. Marsh grew pale but maintained her composure with admirable fortitude. "Inspector, I cannot accept that Arthur would steal money, regardless of what evidence appears to suggest." Holmes requested to examine the claim ticket, studying it with that intense concentration that marked his most significant discoveries. After several minutes of careful scrutiny, he passed it to me with a meaningful glance that spoke volumes. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed quietly. "The ticket was purchased 6 days ago, the very day of Marsh's disappearance. Yet observe the ink, Watson. It possesses the peculiar bluish tinge characteristic of Winsor & Newton's discontinued formula, one that has not been available for nearly 2 years. Inspector Gregson frowned with evident confusion. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" "Simply that our forger, while skilled in mimicking Marsh's handwriting, failed to consider the anachronistic nature of his materials. This ticket was written with old ink that Marsh himself could not have possessed, as Mrs. Marsh has confirmed that their household supplies were replaced with modern formulations last spring." The inspector's confidence wavered perceptibly. "That seems rather technical, Mr. Holmes." "Crime often reveals itself through such technicalities, Inspector. The devil, as they say, resides in the details." Holmes's eyes took on that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement. "What we have here is evidence that appears damning on its surface, yet crumbles under careful examination. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to construct a case against Arthur Marsh, but they have made the crucial error of underestimating the power of methodical observation." As evening approached, Holmes announced his intention to pay a call upon Lord Chetwynd. "We shall present ourselves as concerned friends of Mrs. Marsh, seeking to understand these tragic circumstances. Sometimes, Watson, the most direct approach yields the most surprising revelations. The game grows more complex with each passing hour, and I suspect our evening's work will illuminate corners that our adversaries believed safely shrouded in darkness." The trap was indeed beginning to close, though upon whom remained tantalizingly unclear. Chetwynd Place proved to be a rambling Tudor mansion set upon rising ground some 3 miles from Willowbank House, its weathered stone facade and mullioned windows speaking of centuries past. As our hansom rolled up the gravel drive, I could not help but observe the contrast between the house's dignified antiquity and the subtle signs of genteel decline, ivy creeping unchecked across the eastern wall, and fresh wheel ruts in the drive that suggested recent heavy traffic along routes not intended for casual visitors. Holmes's keen eyes catalogued every detail with characteristic precision. "Note the recent activity, Watson," he murmured. "Those ruts speak of substantial cargo, and the clay adhering to the drive's edges bears that distinctive reddish hue we observed at Willowbank House. Most curious for a property supposedly isolated from such geological formations. We were received in a long, oak-panelled hall where family portraits gazed down with melancholy hauteur. Lord Chetwynd appeared presently, his manner one of carefully regulated surprise, though I detected the subtle signs of strain that Holmes had taught me to recognize, the slight tremor in his hands, the careful adjustment of his cravat. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, is it not? Inspector Gregson mentioned your interest in poor Marsh's situation. I confess I did not expect the matter to warrant your personal attention." Holmes bowed with gracious formality. "I am here purely as a friend to Mrs. Marsh, your lordship. Any information bearing upon her husband's position must naturally concern me. You have suffered an unfortunate loss, I understand." Lord Chetwynd's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. "A most vexing business, Mr. Holmes, substantial sums unaccounted for, and the man responsible vanishes without explanation. One must admit, appearances are scarcely in his favour." During our conversation, Holmes's attention appeared to wander to the room's appointments, though I knew his observations were anything but casual. His eyes lingered particularly upon a magnificent display of antique weapons adorning the far wall, and upon a writing desk positioned near the window whose lock bore fresh scratches. "You have a remarkable collection of arms, my lord," Holmes observed, indicating the display. "That Turkish scimitar above the mantel, magnificent workmanship. Though I see the rust has been recently cleaned from its guard, river damp is a persistent enemy to steel." For the briefest instant, Lord Chetwynd's hand twitched toward the weapon, then fell back to his side. His eyes flashed with something that might have been alarm before being replaced by practiced composure. "The climate here is murderous to metal, Mr. Holmes. One must be vigilant." Our interview was interrupted by the arrival of a thin, nervous man introduced as Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, the estate manager. His darting eyes and restless manner suggested someone labouring under considerable anxiety, and I observed the meaningful glance that passed between him and his employer. "Blackwood handles the practical details of estate management," Lord Chetwynd explained, though his tone carried an unmistakable warning. "Perhaps you gentlemen would care to see something of the grounds?" As we strolled through the formal gardens, Holmes engaged Blackwood in seemingly casual conversation. The manager's responses revealed intimate familiarity with every aspect of the property, yet growing discomfort as Holmes's questions grew more specific about recent activities and deliveries. Our tour led us past the estate's private wharf, where a substantial launch bobbed at its moorings. Holmes noted the vessel's capacity and the scuff marks along its gunwales that spoke of recent heavy cargo, though he made no immediate comment. "You make frequent use of the river, your lordship?" he inquired, as we paused to admire the view. "Occasionally. The Thames provides convenient access to London when discretion is required." Lord Chetwynd's reply was casual, yet I detected an undercurrent of tension that his words did little to conceal. We took our leave after some further inconsequential talk, but once we were again in our cab, Holmes's manner grew intensely animated. "Watson, we are dealing with individuals of considerable sophistication. Lord Chetwynd's performance was masterful, the concerned nobleman reluctantly accepting evidence against a trusted employee. Yet the details betray him at every turn." "How so, Holmes?" "The clay upon his boots this morning was identical to that we observed at Willowbank House, yet he claimed it came from quarry work near his estate. The writing desk bore fresh scratches around the lock, suggesting recent forced entry. Most significantly, that Turkish scimitar showed the same rust-staining pattern we noted upon the stones by the river. It has been used recently in proximity to water." That evening brought a fresh complication in the form of a second communication purporting to come from Arthur Marsh. Mrs. Marsh, pale and visibly shaken, placed the letter in Holmes's hands with trembling fingers. "The handwriting is a far more accomplished forgery than the first," Holmes observed after careful examination. "The same imitator, but with more leisure and practice. Our adversaries are refining their methods." The message requested that a small wooden box be sent under plain wrapper to a London address near the docks. "Will you comply with the request?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual excitement. "Indeed I shall, Watson, but the contents will differ considerably from what our friends anticipate. There is no better way to learn a man's intentions than to appear to comply with his requests while maintaining complete control of the situation." He turned the small wooden case over in his long fingers. This box once contained something of sufficient value to tempt men into elaborate crime, yet small enough to rest upon a riverbed and be raised under cover of darkness. Something connected intimately with Lord Chetwynd's affairs, I'll warrant. But to what end, Holmes? That, my dear Watson, is precisely what our opponents are most anxious we should not discover. Tomorrow evening, if all proceeds according to my design, they will reveal it themselves. The game grows more complex with each passing hour, and I suspect our adversaries have seriously underestimated both the power of methodical observation and the determination of a devoted wife. The willows whispered their ancient secrets as darkness settled over the countryside, and I could not shake the conviction that we stood upon the threshold of revelations that would illuminate the darkest corners of this perplexing mystery. The following morning found Holmes in a state of intense concentration, his attention focused entirely upon the mysterious wooden box that had featured so prominently in the forged correspondence. He had transformed our temporary quarters at Willowbank House into an impromptu laboratory, with Mrs. Hudson's tea service pressed into duty alongside his travelling case of analytical instruments. Holmes's scientific investigation. The box itself proved far more revealing under Holmes's methodical examination than its plain appearance might suggest. Fashioned from a dark, close-grained wood that bore the distinctive markings of tropical origin, it measured precisely 12 inches in length, 8 in width, and 6 in depth. The brass fittings, though tarnished with age, showed recent handling, and the velvet lining retained faint traces of a substance that immediately captured Holmes's attention. "Observe, Watson," he said, indicating minute golden particles that glittered upon his lens. "We have here traces of alluvial gold, not the refined product of a jeweller's workshop, but raw dust such as one might recover from river sediments. Note the angular crystalline structure and the reddish clay adhering to several particles." His analysis continued with characteristic thoroughness. Scraping samples from the box's corners and hinges, Holmes identified traces of river water, organic matter consistent with prolonged submersion, and, most significantly, particles of a distinctive reddish clay that matched exactly the samples we had observed upon Lord Chetwynd's boots. "This container has spent considerable time beneath the waters of our local river," Holmes concluded. "It was designed to protect valuable contents from moisture during extended submersion, then retrieved when circumstances required. The question remains, what manner of contents justified such elaborate precautions?" Expanding intelligence. Holmes's morning inquiries in the village had yielded intelligence that cast the entire affair in a more sinister light. The local postmaster, a garrulous gentleman whose position afforded him intimate knowledge of neighbourhood correspondence, revealed that Lord Chetwynd had been receiving regular communications from continental addresses, specifically from financial houses in Amsterdam and Geneva, known for their discretion in international transactions. More significantly, Holmes continued, consulting his notes, the station agent confirms that several foreign gentlemen arrived by special train on the very evening of Marsh's disappearance. They departed yesterday under cover of darkness, taking with them substantial luggage that required considerable effort to load aboard Lord Chetwynd's private launch. Mrs. Marsh, who had joined us for this discussion, provided crucial context regarding her husband's growing concerns. Arthur had mentioned Lord Chetwynd's unusual banking arrangements on several occasions, she explained. Large sums arriving from foreign sources, then being distributed in smaller amounts through a network of intermediary accounts. Arthur found the pattern puzzling, though he could not initially articulate his specific concerns. Your husband's banker's instincts detected irregularities that his professional training could not ignore, Holmes observed. Such scruples would indeed prove most inconvenient to individuals engaged in systematic financial manipulation. Strategic preparation. Rather than simply forwarding the wooden box as requested in the forged letter, Holmes conceived a plan of considerable ingenuity. He spent the better part of the afternoon preparing what he termed a more instructive substitute, carefully removing Mrs. Marsh's personal effects and replacing them with items calculated to test our adversary's knowledge and intentions. Into the box he placed a small lead fishing weight wrapped in tissue paper to prevent rattling, along with a carefully selected page from the Financial Times, highlighting recent fluctuations in colonial mining shares. Most ingeniously, he concealed within the box's false bottom a small device of his own invention, a modified compass whose magnetic needle had been treated with a luminous compound that would enable us to track the container's movements even in darkness. Our opponents expect compliance with their demands, Holmes explained, as he sealed the box with meticulous attention to replicating the original appearance. They shall receive it, but the contents will serve our purposes rather than theirs. This bait will draw them into the open, where their true objectives must inevitably be revealed. The conspiracy's true scope. As evening approached, Holmes's analysis of the accumulated evidence revealed the outline of a conspiracy far more sophisticated than simple embezzlement. The combination of foreign connections, colonial gold dust, and systematic financial manipulation suggested an operation designed to transfer substantial wealth through channels that would escape official scrutiny. Arthur Marsh's position at Fife and Marbury made him an ideal instrument for such transactions, Holmes observed. His reputation for integrity would have provided perfect cover for irregular transfers, while his access to confidential banking information enabled the manipulation of multiple accounts. When his professional scruples finally asserted themselves, he became not merely an obstacle, but a dangerous witness to systematic fraud. The implications were sobering. We were dealing not with a domestic tragedy involving a wayward husband, but with an international conspiracy that had claimed Arthur Marsh as its victim precisely because of his honesty and professional competence. Rising stakes. That evening, as Holmes prepared to dispatch our carefully prepared decoy to the London address, a telegram arrived that confirmed both the urgency of our situation and the dangerous sophistication of our adversaries. The message, addressed to Holmes personally, was brief but chilling. Your interference is noted and unwelcome. Cease your inquiries immediately, or the banker's fate will serve as an example to others who would obstruct legitimate business arrangements. They know of our involvement, I observed with growing concern. Indeed, Watson, and their knowledge suggests surveillance capabilities that extend well beyond the confines of Chislehurst. We are dealing with individuals who possess both resources and connections sufficient to monitor our activities and respond with disturbing promptness. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual excitement mixed with determination. However, their very awareness of our presence confirms that Arthur Marsh remains alive. Dead men require no threats to ensure their silence. As darkness settled over Willowbank House, Holmes outlined the next phase of our investigation. The wooden box would serve as both bait and tracker, drawing our adversaries into revealing their true location and objectives. Meanwhile, we would maintain careful surveillance of both Lord Chetwynd's activities and the mysterious, nocturnal gatherings by the river. The game grows more complex with each passing hour, Holmes concluded. But complexity brings opportunity for those who can read its patterns correctly. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall discover whether our opponent's confidence in their own cleverness has led them to underestimate the power of methodical observation and logical deduction. The willows whispered their ancient secrets in the night wind, and I could not escape the conviction that we stood upon the threshold of revelations that would illuminate the darkest corners of this increasingly perilous mystery. The following day brought developments that transformed our investigation from methodical inquiry into urgent pursuit. Holmes had risen before dawn, his keen mind already focused upon the intricate web of deception we had begun to unravel. The morning light revealed him at his travelling desk, surrounded by telegrams, maps, and the accumulated evidence of our investigation, his long fingers tracing patterns that spoke of conspiracy far more elaborate than simple embezzlement. Intelligence and preparation. Holmes's network of informants had worked through the night, and their reports painted a disturbing picture of accelerated activity at Chetwynd Place. The estate's usual complement of servants had been supplemented by several foreign gentlemen whose bearing and dress suggested both wealth and urgency. More significantly, substantial quantities of packing materials had been delivered under cover of darkness, along with a heavy wagon that departed shortly before dawn, its cargo concealed beneath canvas coverings. "Our adversaries are preparing for departure, Watson," Holmes observed, studying a hastily scrawled message from one of his street irregulars. "The dispatch of our decoy box has forced their hand. They can no longer afford the luxury of gradual, methodical operations." Mrs. Marsh, displaying remarkable fortitude under the circumstances, had proven invaluable in gathering local intelligence. Her discreet inquiries among village tradesmen revealed that Lord Chetwynd had recently purchased unusual quantities of waterproof containers and industrial cordage, materials perfectly suited for the concealment and transport of valuable cargo by river. "Your husband's disappearance has disrupted a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise," Holmes explained to our client. "They require his continued silence, but they can no longer risk maintaining him in the vicinity. Tonight, I believe, will see the culmination of their plans and our opportunity to rescue Arthur and expose their crimes." Strategic surveillance. As evening approached, Holmes outlined his strategy with characteristic precision. We would position ourselves along the river between Willowbank House and Chetwynd Place, where the willows provided natural concealment while affording clear observation of water traffic. His analysis of local currents and tides suggested that any substantial cargo movement would necessarily follow the main channel, bringing it within range of our surveillance. "The river has been their highway throughout this affair," Holmes explained as we prepared our equipment. "Whatever treasure they recovered from its bed, whatever secrets Arthur Marsh discovered in their financial arrangements, all roads lead back to these dark waters. Tonight, the Thames shall yield its final secret." Our preparations were meticulous. Holmes had procured field glasses from the local constabulary, along with a detailed ordnance survey map marking every bend and landing along our stretch of river. Most ingeniously, he had modified a small pocket compass with luminous paint, creating a makeshift direction finder that would enable us to track any large metal objects moving through the darkness. The night vigil. We took up our position among the alders shortly after 10 o'clock, the November fog providing additional concealment while muffling the sounds of our movement. The willows of Willowbank House loomed ghost-like across the water, their drooping branches creating shifting patterns of shadow and reflected moonlight. Holmes's patience during surveillance operations was legendary, but tonight I detected an undercurrent of suppressed energy that spoke of approaching resolution. His keen eyes swept constantly between the two estates, cataloguing every movement, every variation in the pattern of lights and shadows. It was near midnight when the rhythmic throb of an engine announced the approach of Lord Chetwynd's launch. The vessel moved without navigation lights, its progress marked only by the faint phosphorescence of disturbed water and the occasional gleam of a heavily shaded lantern. "3 figures aboard," Holmes murmured, raising the field glasses to his eyes. "Lord Chetwynd at the helm, Blackwood in the bow with a sounding pole, and a third man I do not recognize, foreign by his bearing and dress. Note the cargo amidships, several large containers, carefully secured and covered with tarpaulins." As the launch approached the willows of Willowbank House, it slowed perceptibly. The shaded lantern was directed downward toward the water, and we could hear low voices engaged in urgent consultation. Blackwood's pole probed the river bottom with systematic precision, as if searching for specific landmarks or hidden markers. The discovery. Holmes's modified compass suddenly began to deflect from true north, its luminous needle swinging toward the launch with unmistakable purpose. "Magnetic ore, Watson," he whispered with satisfaction. "Our river treasure contains substantial quantities of metallic content, gold most likely, mixed with iron-bearing minerals. The compass confirms what the evidence has long suggested." The launch continued downstream, but rather than proceeding toward London, as we had anticipated, it turned into a narrow tributary that wound through the marshland beyond Chetwynd's boundaries. Holmes consulted his map with growing excitement. "The old mill race," he breathed. "It leads to the ruins of Blackwater Mill, abandoned these 20 years past. The perfect location for clandestine operations, isolated, accessible only by water, and with sufficient cover to conceal substantial activities." We followed at a distance, using a small punt Holmes had positioned earlier for just such a contingency. The tributary narrowed as we proceeded, its banks rising to form a natural canyon that would muffle sound and conceal light. Ancient willows overhung the water, their gnarled branches creating a tunnel-like passage that seemed to lead into the very heart of darkness. The mill ruins. Blackwater Mill proved to be a substantial complex of crumbling stone buildings clustered around the remains of a great water wheel. The mill race had been diverted to create a sheltered basin where boats could moor unseen from the main river. Lord Chetwynd's launch lay alongside a second vessel, a steam yacht of considerable size whose foreign registry and sleek lines spoke of speed and discretion. Holmes guided our punt into the concealment of overhanging branches, from where we could observe the transfer of cargo from launch to yacht. The operation proceeded with military precision, each container being weighed and recorded before disappearing into the yacht's hold. Most significantly, we observed the emergence of a fourth figure from the mill's ruined buildings, a man whose posture and gait, even in the uncertain light, were unmistakably familiar. "Arthur Marsh," Holmes whispered with grim satisfaction, "alive as I predicted, but clearly under duress. Note how closely he is guarded, and the evident strain in his bearing. Our missing banker has been preserved as insurance against exactly the kind of investigation we have conducted." The revelation. As we watched, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This was no simple embezzlement, but an elaborate international operation designed to transfer stolen colonial gold through British banking channels. Arthur Marsh's position at Fife and Marbury had made him an ideal unwitting accomplice, while his reputation for integrity provided perfect cover for irregular transactions. The containers being loaded aboard the yacht represented the accumulated proceeds of systematic theft from colonial mining operations, processed through multiple intermediaries and temporarily concealed in the riverbed while awaiting final transport to continental markets. Lord Chetwynd's social position and banking connections had enabled the conversion of raw gold into legitimate currency, while the River Cray provided both concealment and transportation for the stolen treasure. "Watson," Holmes whispered as the loading operation neared completion, "we have perhaps minutes before they depart with both their treasure and our client's husband. The time for observation has ended. Now we must act." The willows whispered their ancient secrets in the night wind, but their voices now carried the promise of justice for Arthur Marsh and exposure of crimes that threatened the very foundations of British financial integrity. The game had reached its climax, and Holmes's eyes gleamed with that fierce light of intellectual triumph mixed with righteous determination that marked his finest hours. Tomorrow would bring resolution, but tonight belonged to shadows, secrets, and the deadly dance between criminal cunning and detective genius that had brought us to this remote and sinister place. The moment for decisive action had arrived with the methodical precision that characterized Holmes's most critical interventions. From our concealment among the willows, we observed the final preparations aboard the steam yacht where Arthur Marsh stood under heavy guard, his bearing reflecting both the strain of prolonged captivity and the dignity that had marked his banking career. Strategic assessment and preparation. Holmes's tactical mind had been working throughout our surveillance, analyzing every detail of the mill's geography and the criminal's positioning. "Watson," he whispered, with that intense focus that preceded his most audacious moves, "observe their arrangement. The yacht lies broadside to the current, her stern secured to the loading platform, while her bow points toward the main channel. A single, severed mooring line would swing her across this narrow waterway, creating an effective barrier to escape." His plan unfolded with characteristic thoroughness. Earlier that afternoon, Holmes had dispatched a coded telegram to Inspector Gregson, providing precise coordinates and requesting river police support. The message had been deliberately cryptic, designed to ensure official response while maintaining operational security. Now, as the final phase approached, every element fell into place with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. "Your military training serves us well tonight, my dear fellow," Holmes continued, indicating the yacht's position. "That steam engine represents their means of escape, but also their vulnerability. A well-placed shot to disable the boiler's pressure system would prevent immediate departure without endangering lives unnecessarily. The coordinated strike." Holmes's approach combined tactical brilliance with psychological insight. While I positioned myself to disable the yacht's motive power, he would create maximum confusion by severing the stern mooring line, trapping the vessel, while simultaneously revealing himself to the conspirators. The psychological impact of his sudden appearance, combined with the yacht's mechanical failure, would create the disarray necessary for Arthur Marsh's rescue. Moving with the stealth that had served him through countless dangerous investigations, Holmes slipped through the mill ruins toward the stone quay where the mooring lines were secured. I could track his progress only by the occasional displacement of loose masonry and the faint gleam of his dark lantern as he navigated the treacherous footing among collapsed walls and ancient machinery. Taking careful aim through the thick foliage, I fired at the yacht's pressure gauge. The crack of my service revolver echoed through the narrow waterway, followed immediately by a violent hiss of escaping steam. A cloud of vapor billowed upward, momentarily obscuring the vessel and eliciting shouts of alarm from those aboard. The engine, which had been idling in preparation for departure, sputtered and died. The confrontation. The confusion provided Holmes with the opening he required. A sharp crack from the mill ruins marked the severing of the stern mooring line, and the yacht's stern swung out into the stream, her bow remaining secured to the loading platform. The vessel now blocked the narrow channel completely, creating an effective barrier to escape while trapping the conspirators in their chosen refuge. Holmes emerged from the shadows with startling suddenness, his tall figure silhouetted against the mill's crumbling stone walls like some avenging spirit summoned from the Thames's dark waters. His appearance had an electric effect upon the assembled criminals, freezing them momentarily in tableau of guilt and alarm. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes called across the narrow gap, his voice carrying that quiet authority which marked his most devastating revelations. "I trust you will forgive the dramatic nature of my arrival, but circumstances seem to require immediate attention to your departure arrangements." Lord Chetwynd, his aristocratic composure finally cracking under the strain, began a stammering protest about misunderstandings and legitimate business arrangements. The foreign gentleman who commanded the operation responded more decisively, barking orders in what sounded like Dutch, while drawing a heavy pistol from his coat. Arthur Marsh's courage. It was at this crucial moment that Arthur Marsh demonstrated the integrity that had first made him dangerous to the conspiracy. As his guard's attention focused upon Holmes's dramatic appearance, Marsh threw himself sideways, breaking free from immediate restraint with a surge of desperate energy. His action created sufficient confusion to disrupt the criminal's coordinated response. "The game is over, your lordship," Holmes declared with cold precision. "The gold dust beneath your fingernails, the distinctive clay upon your boots, and, most significantly, the Turkish scimitar in your collection, all bear traces of river water and the mineral deposits we have recovered from this location. Your elaborate deception has been thoroughly exposed." The resolution. The arrival of Inspector Gregson's forces marked the end of organized resistance. Police launches appeared from both directions, their powerful searchlights transforming night into day and revealing the full extent of the criminal operation. The steam yacht, trapped by Holmes's severed mooring line and disabled by my precise shot, could neither advance nor retreat, while her crew found themselves surrounded by representatives of British law enforcement. The foreign gentleman's attempt at armed resistance proved futile. Holmes's service revolver spoke twice in rapid succession, the shots carefully aimed to disable rather than kill. The criminal's weapon spun from his grasp, while Blackwood collapsed with a cry of pain, clutching his wounded shoulder. Lord Chetwynd, faced with undeniable evidence and overwhelming force, made no further attempt at resistance. The brief spasm of violence seemed to break something within him. His shoulders sagged, and he allowed his hands to be bound without further protest, though his eyes burned with bitter, hopeless fury. Evidence and aftermath. As dawn broke over the mill ruins, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The yacht's hold contained not merely stolen gold, but documentation revealing a network of criminal enterprises spanning 3 continents. Colonial mining operations had been systematically plundered, their proceeds channeled through British banking houses before being converted into untraceable continental currencies. Arthur Marsh, though exhausted by his ordeal, provided crucial testimony regarding the methods employed to manipulate banking records and create false documentation. His professional integrity had ultimately made him too dangerous to the conspiracy's continued operation, leading to his disappearance and the elaborate frame designed to discredit his character. "The irony," Holmes observed as the prisoners were led away, "is that their very sophistication made them vulnerable. The more elaborate their deceptions, the more evidence they created of their criminal activities. Arthur Marsh's disappearance was meant to silence a dangerous witness, but instead it provided the key that unlocked their entire operation." Holmes's first concern amid the confusion had been for our client's husband. Striding across the quay with long, purposeful steps, he personally ensured Arthur Marsh's safety and immediate medical attention. The reunion between husband and wife would wait until we returned to Willowbank House, but the shadow of false accusation had finally been lifted. The willows of Blackwater Mill whispered their ancient secrets in the morning breeze, but their voices now carried the promise of justice served and truth revealed. The game had reached its visible conclusion, yet the full explanation of how every clue, every whisper among the willows had formed part of this elaborate tapestry of crime would await the quieter surroundings of 221B Baker Street, where Holmes would demonstrate once again the supreme power of methodical observation and logical deduction. The morning following our dramatic intervention at Blackwater Mill brought a profound transformation to Willowbank House. The atmosphere of dread and uncertainty that had hung over the property like the Thames fog had dissipated entirely, replaced by the quiet joy of a family reunited and justice served. Arthur Marsh, though bearing the physical marks of his ordeal in the gauntness around his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands, had recovered his natural dignity with remarkable resilience. The reunion and recovery. Eleanor Marsh's reunion with her husband provided one of those touching human moments that reminded me why Holmes's work, for all its intellectual brilliance, ultimately served the cause of human happiness. Their embrace in the morning room, witnessed only by the pale November sunlight filtering through the windows, spoke volumes about the power of unwavering faith and devoted love. Holmes, with characteristic delicacy, had withdrawn to examine his notes, while the couple shared their private moment. When we reconvened in the familiar sitting room, Arthur Marsh was prepared to provide the missing pieces of our puzzle with the methodical precision that had made him so valuable to both his employers and, ultimately, his enemies. Arthur Marsh's account. The irregularities in Lord Chetwynd's accounts first attracted my attention nearly 6 months ago, Marsh began, his voice steady despite the strain of recent events. Large deposits from what appeared to be legitimate colonial mining ventures, but followed by complex patterns of withdrawal and transfer that seemed designed to obscure rather than facilitate legitimate commerce. His banker's training had enabled him to recognize the subtle signs of systematic money laundering that would have escaped less experienced observers. I discovered a hidden ledger, Mr. Holmes, coded within our standard accounting systems. It detailed the true source of these funds, systematically looted gold from newly discovered veins in remote African colonies. Lord Chetwynd and his foreign associates were using Fife and Marbury as a conduit to transform stolen treasure into legitimate currency. The night of his disappearance had begun with a confrontation that sealed his fate. I demanded a complete explanation from Lord Chetwynd, threatening to report my concerns to the bank's directors. His response was swift and chilling. He spoke of powerful interests, both colonial and continental, who would not tolerate interference with their operations. Holmes's methodical explanation. Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his keen eyes bright with that familiar light of intellectual satisfaction. Your husband's integrity, Mrs. Marsh, was both his greatest protection and his greatest danger. The criminals required his banking expertise to legitimize their transactions, but that same knowledge enabled him to recognize the patterns of systematic fraud. He began his characteristic reconstruction with methodical precision. Consider the sequence of evidence. The whispering willows that so disturbed Arthur were indeed human voices, the hushed conferences necessary to coordinate complex international operations. The wooden box, with its tropical hardwood construction and waterproof fittings, was designed specifically for prolonged submersion in the river, protecting samples of stolen gold from moisture and detection. The detective's analysis revealed the elegant sophistication of the criminal enterprise. The choice of the River Cray was particularly astute. Its tidal nature enabled the concealment of heavy containers during low water, while the willow groves provided both physical concealment and acoustic masking for nocturnal operations. The rust stains we observed on both the riverbank stones and Lord Chetwynd's Turkish scimitar told their own story of repeated use in recovering treasure from the riverbed. The international conspiracy. Holmes's examination of the captured documents had revealed connections extending far beyond the immediate conspiracy. We were dealing with a sophisticated international network, Watson. Dutch colonial administrators had been systematically diverting gold from legitimate mining operations, shipping it to England through carefully established smuggling routes. The foreign gentleman who commanded the yacht represented interests whose tentacles reached across 3 continents. The psychological dimension of the case proved equally fascinating. The criminals faced a complex challenge. They needed Arthur's expertise to process their stolen wealth, but his professional integrity made him increasingly dangerous as he uncovered their methods. Rather than simply eliminating him, they chose a more sophisticated approach, using his disappearance to serve multiple purposes. The elaborate deception. The forged communications, the planted evidence at Victoria Station, the subtle pressure on Inspector Gregson to conclude that Arthur had absconded, all were designed to transform him from accuser to accused, Holmes explained. They sought to eliminate a dangerous witness while simultaneously discrediting his potential testimony. Arthur Marsh nodded grimly. They held me captive at Blackwater Mill, attempting to coerce my cooperation through threats against Eleanor's safety. I feigned compliance while hoping desperately for rescue, knowing that my usefulness to them was rapidly diminishing. Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Their very sophistication became their vulnerability. The more elaborate their deception, the more evidence they created of criminal intent. The anachronistic ink on the forged claim ticket, the distinctive clay that connected multiple crime scenes, the foreign correspondence that established international connections, each detail contributed to their ultimate exposure. Justice and resolution. The legal consequences would prove severe for all involved. Lord Chetwynd faced charges of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to theft on an international scale, while the exposure of the foreign network had prompted investigations in multiple countries. The recovered gold would eventually be restored to its rightful owners, though the process would require months of careful documentation and international cooperation. For Arthur and Eleanor Marsh, vindication brought not merely personal relief, but professional restoration. The bank's directors, initially skeptical of his protestations of innocence, now recognized his integrity as the very quality that had made him dangerous to systematic fraud. His position was not merely restored but enhanced, with additional responsibilities reflecting his demonstrated ability to detect sophisticated financial manipulation. Philosophical reflection. As we prepared to return to London that afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey we had undertaken. What had begun as a seemingly simple case of domestic distress had evolved into a confrontation with international criminal enterprise, revealing the darker underbelly of colonial commerce and the vulnerability of even the most established financial institutions to systematic corruption. "It is a sobering thought, Holmes," I remarked, as we gathered our belongings, "that a man's honesty could prove so dangerous in this modern world." Holmes paused in his packing, his hawk-like features softening slightly. "Indeed, Watson, but consider the alternative. Integrity, when it confronts organized avarice, may appear foolish to the cynical observer. Yet it is precisely that integrity which ultimately triumphs over the most sophisticated forms of villainy. Arthur Marsh's refusal to compromise his principles not only saved his reputation but exposed a network of criminals that might otherwise have continued their depredations unchecked. Atmospheric closure. As our carriage rolled away from Willowbank House, I looked back to see the willows swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. No longer did they whisper secrets of fear and conspiracy, but seemed instead to rustle with peaceful contentment, their drooping branches creating natural curtains that would shelter the Marsh family's renewed happiness rather than concealing criminal machinations. The case of the Whispering Willows had reached its satisfying conclusion, demonstrating once again that methodical observation, logical deduction, and unwavering moral courage could illuminate even the darkest corners of human villainy. Holmes sat opposite me in the railway carriage, already absorbed in the morning papers, but I detected the faint smile of satisfaction that marked the successful resolution of a particularly challenging investigation. The game was indeed afoot, but this particular contest between criminal cunning and detective genius had reached its inevitable conclusion, with truth revealed, justice served, and innocence vindicated through the supreme power of the human mind, applied with both precision and compassion. The familiar embrace of London's November fog welcomed us home as our hansom cab rattled through the gaslit streets toward Baker Street. The great city wrapped itself once more in its dingy yellow shroud, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into mysterious passages that seemed to muffle both sound and time itself. Yet there was something profoundly comforting in this atmospheric homecoming, as if the very fog that had witnessed the beginning of our adventure now conspired to provide a fitting conclusion to the case of the Whispering Willows. Our sitting room at 221B had never appeared more inviting than it did that evening. Mrs. Hudson had prepared an excellent fire that crackled cheerfully upon the hearth, while the gas lamps cast their warm, steady glow across the familiar chaos of Holmes's papers, chemical apparatus, and accumulated evidence. The detective himself had thrown himself into his customary armchair with that characteristic transition from intense activity to contemplative repose, his long, nervous fingers steepled beneath his chin as he gazed into the dancing flames. I had spent the better part of the evening attempting to organize my notes, though the complexity of our recent adventure seemed to resist orderly narrative arrangement. The transformation from a simple case of domestic distress into an international conspiracy of breathtaking scope had left me with more questions than answers, despite our successful resolution of Arthur Marsh's disappearance and the exposure of Lord Chetwynd's criminal enterprise. "Holmes," I said at length, setting aside my pen and turning to my companion, "there remain aspects of this extraordinary affair that continue to perplex me. The sequence of events is clear enough, and the conspiracy now stands fully exposed, yet certain subtleties of your method still elude my understanding." Holmes's eyes opened fully, that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction brightening his hawk-like features. "Then I have been remiss, my dear Watson, if I have left your excellent mind unsatisfied with mere results rather than methodology. The case of the Whispering Willows offers several instructive examples of how seemingly insignificant details can illuminate the darkest criminal enterprises. Pray, state your difficulties." "Your conviction that Arthur Marsh remained alive puzzled me from the outset," I began. "Even when Inspector Gregson and the physical evidence suggested the opposite conclusion, you maintained unwavering certainty in his survival. Upon what foundation did you build such assurance?" Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes taking on that intense focus that marked his most illuminating explanations. "Upon the logic of criminal necessity, Watson. Consider the elaborate nature of the deception constructed around Marsh's disappearance, the forged communications, the planted evidence at Victoria Station, the systematic manipulation of banking records. If the conspirators had simply murdered Marsh immediately upon discovering his inconvenient scruples, what purpose would such elaborate misdirection serve?" He rose and moved to the mantelpiece. where several pieces of evidence from our investigation remained arranged for final analysis. Dead men cannot transfer funds, manipulate accounts, or provide expert guidance in complex financial transactions. The very existence of the forged letters requesting specific actions proved that Marsh's expertise remained essential to their operations. They required not merely his silence, but his continued, albeit coerced, participation. Yet might they not have wished simply to destroy his reputation posthumously? I suggested. Character assassination would have been achieved far more efficiently through different means, Holmes replied, picking up the wooden box that had featured so prominently in our investigation. The second forged communication, requesting that this container be dispatched to London, revealed ongoing operational requirements. It spoke not of closing a criminal chapter, but of continued dependence upon Marsh's banking expertise. I nodded, beginning to perceive the logical structure underlying his reasoning. And there is the matter of Lord Chetwynd himself. Until our visit to his estate, I struggled to reconcile his aristocratic position with the sordid nature of the crimes. You suspected him almost from our first encounter with the case. Holmes's lips curved in that slight smile I had learned to associate with his most elegant deductions. The convergence of multiple lines of evidence, Watson, rather than any single damning detail. The distinctive reddish clay upon his boots connected him directly to the riverside activities at Willowbank House, yet his estate lies upon chalk downs entirely free from such geological formations. His nervous adjustment of his cravat during our interview, the fresh scratches around his writing desk's lock, the recently cleaned but still water-stained Turkish scimitar, each detail contributed to a pattern of deception. The detective's analysis expanded to encompass the broader implications of our investigation. We were confronting a distinctly modern form of criminal enterprise, Watson, one that exploits the very mechanisms of legitimate international commerce. Colonial expansion has created unprecedented opportunities for systematic theft, while improved communications enable criminals to operate across continents with apparent impunity. Holmes returned to his chair, his expression growing more thoughtful. The gold that financed this conspiracy was stolen not through dramatic robbery, but through patient manipulation of administrative systems thousands of miles from London. Dutch colonial officials systematically diverted legitimate mining proceeds, shipping them to England through carefully established smuggling routes. Lord Chetwynd's social position and banking connections provided the perfect mechanism for converting stolen treasure into legitimate currency. The psychological dimension proves equally fascinating, he continued. Lord Chetwynd represents the modern criminal aristocrat, respectable, well-connected, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of profit. Such individuals exploit the complexities of international law and the limitations of national jurisdiction to operate with seeming immunity. I found myself reflecting on the human elements that had ultimately exposed this sophisticated conspiracy. Mrs. Marsh's unwavering faith in her husband's integrity provided the initial crack in their carefully constructed deception. Precisely, Holmes agreed with evident satisfaction. Human loyalty, Watson, remains one of the few forces that criminal calculation cannot anticipate or neutralize. The conspirators understood ledgers, currencies, and international exchange to perfection, yet they failed to account for a devoted wife's determination and a detective's methodical curiosity. The detective's eyes gleamed as he recalled the technical aspects of our investigation. That modified compass which enabled us to track metallic cargo through darkness represents the kind of practical innovation that modern detection requires. Criminal methods evolve constantly, and our techniques must adapt accordingly. The luminous treatment of the needle was merely a convenience. The deflection itself resulted from the magnetic properties of substantial iron-bearing ore mixed with auriferous deposits. As the evening deepened, and the fire settled into glowing embers, Holmes's reflections turned to broader questions of justice and social order. This case demonstrates that crime, however sophisticated its methods, ultimately depends upon fundamental human weaknesses, greed, fear, and the willingness to exploit others for personal advantage. Yet the same human qualities that enable criminal enterprise can be turned to its detection and prevention. He paused, gazing into the dying flames with that distant expression I recognized as his most philosophical mood. Arthur Marsh's integrity, Eleanor Marsh's devotion, even Inspector Gregson's methodical police work, all contributed to the conspiracy's exposure. The Willows whispered their secrets to anyone willing to listen carefully, just as physical evidence speaks plainly to those prepared to read its testimony correctly. A gentle tap upon our door announced Mrs. Hudson with the Evening Post, including a telegram from Eleanor Marsh expressing profound gratitude for her husband's safe return and their family's restoration to happiness. Holmes read the message with quiet satisfaction before consigning it to the flames with characteristic discretion. The case has revealed vulnerabilities in our financial institutions that require immediate attention, he observed, watching the paper curl and blacken. The ease with which stolen colonial gold could be converted into legitimate currency suggests systematic weaknesses that other criminals will undoubtedly attempt to exploit. Yet tonight we may rest in the knowledge that justice has been served and innocence vindicated. As the London fog pressed against our windows and the great city settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Holmes rose and moved to peer into the swirling darkness beyond the glass. "The game is indeed eternal, Watson. Each case resolved reveals new challenges. Each criminal exposed demonstrates the ingenuity of those who would follow. Yet the methods remain constant: patient observation, logical deduction, an unwavering commitment to truth over convenient assumption." He turned back toward the firelight, his thin features sharp with that familiar mixture of intellectual satisfaction and anticipatory energy. Our success in this affair resulted not from extraordinary insight, but from the methodical application of scientific principle to human behavior. The criminals' very sophistication became their vulnerability. The more elaborate their deception, the more evidence they created of their criminal intent. "And so ends another chapter," I observed, taking up my pen once more to complete my account of our extraordinary adventure. Holmes settled back into his chair, reaching for his pipe with evident contentment. "The Whispering Willows have fallen silent, Watson. Their mysteries resolved and their secrets revealed. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new puzzles to test our methods and our resolve. But tonight, let us be content with the knowledge that truth has triumphed over deception and that the innocent have been vindicated through the patient application of human reason to the complexities of criminal enterprise." The November wind sighed through the London streets, carrying with it the promise of future adventures and the eternal contest between criminal cunning and detective genius that had become the defining passion of our remarkable partnership. In the quiet familiarity of our Baker Street sanctuary, with the fog heavy outside and the fire burning low, the case of the Whispering Willows passed from living drama into the chronicles of those singular adventures which it has been my privilege to share with the man I shall ever regard as the supreme master of observation and deduction in our time. In the weeks that followed our dramatic intervention at Blackwater Mill, the familiar rhythms of Baker Street life gradually reasserted themselves, though not without subtle alterations that spoke to the profound impact of our recent adventure. Holmes, with characteristic mercurial temperament, had thrown himself into the study of ancient Mesopotamian dialects, yet I observed him more than once pausing in his scholarly pursuits to gaze thoughtfully at the wooden box from Willowbank House, which now occupied a place of honor among his collection of criminal memorabilia. The correspondence of consequences. The Morning Post brought a steady stream of letters that illuminated the far-reaching implications of our investigation. Eleanor Marsh's correspondence proved particularly moving, her careful script conveying both profound gratitude and the quiet joy of a family restored to happiness and honor. "Arthur has resumed his duties with renewed purpose," she wrote in her latest communication. "He speaks often of your methods, Mr. Holmes, and has begun applying similar principles of observation and analysis to his banking responsibilities. The experience has transformed him from a mere custodian of funds into what he terms a sentinel standing watch over the integrity of commerce itself." Holmes read such letters with evident satisfaction, though he characteristically deflected personal praise. "The restoration of Arthur Marsh's reputation," he observed, folding the correspondence carefully, "represents more than individual vindication. It demonstrates that integrity, however severely tested, ultimately triumphs over the most sophisticated forms of criminal deception." Inspector Gregson's official report painted an even broader picture of the conspiracy's scope. The Dutch authorities had uncovered systematic theft dating back nearly 3 years, with mining operations across their African territories systematically plundered through falsified documentation and corrupted administrative oversight. French and Belgian officials had discovered similar operations targeting their colonial territories, suggesting coordination at the highest levels of international criminal enterprise. "We were confronting not merely individual avarice," Holmes remarked during one of our evening discussions, "but systematic corruption that threatened the very foundations of international commerce. The ease with which stolen colonial gold could be converted into legitimate currency exposed vulnerabilities that required immediate attention from banking authorities across Europe." Philosophical reflections on modern crime. One particularly fog-shrouded evening, as we sat before our familiar fire, with the accumulated evidence of the case spread before us, Holmes embarked upon one of those penetrating analyses that revealed both his intellectual brilliance and his deep understanding of human nature. "You will observe, Watson," he said, indicating the wooden box with its faint traces of golden dust, "that this unpretending receptacle embodies the transformation we are witnessing in the nature of crime itself. We are moving from the era of the bludgeon to that of the balance sheet." I leaned forward with interest. "In what sense, Holmes?" "Consider the evolution," he replied, his keen eyes reflecting the firelight. "Here we have no masked burglar scaling ivy-covered walls, no highwayman upon the heath, but an aristocrat in his club, a colonial official at his desk, a foreign financier in his counting-house. The violence is removed, or at least displaced. It falls upon unseen victims thousands of miles away. Native miners, small shareholders, colonial enterprises whose lifeblood is slowly drained rather than dramatically seized." He opened the box and indicated the golden particles that still clung in its crevices. "These grains represent not merely stolen metal, but the crystallized labor and suffering of many men. Yet the hands that grasped them wore kid gloves and belonged to gentlemen who would have recoiled with horror from the sight of physical bloodshed." Technical innovations and professional impact. Holmes's modified compass, which had enabled us to track metallic cargo through darkness, had attracted considerable interest from official quarters. The Metropolitan Police had requested detailed specifications, while the Admiralty expressed curiosity about potential naval applications. With characteristic generosity, Holmes had provided complete technical documentation to any official agency that might benefit from such innovations. "Criminal methods evolve constantly," he explained to a gathering of senior police officials, "and our techniques must adapt accordingly. The compass modification represented merely practical application of established scientific principles to detection requirements. The true innovation lay not in the device itself, but in recognizing the necessity for such tools in combating increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. The banking firm of Fife and Marbury had not merely restored Arthur Marsh to his former position, but had promoted him to senior cashier, recognizing that his expertise in detecting financial manipulation represented a valuable asset in an increasingly complex commercial environment. Other financial institutions had begun implementing similar safeguards, acknowledging that the case had exposed systematic vulnerabilities in their operations. International ramifications. Heinrich van der Berg, the foreign gentleman captured aboard the yacht, had proven to be a former Dutch colonial administrator whose detailed confession revealed the sophisticated methods employed to identify and exploit weaknesses in colonial oversight systems. His testimony had prompted diplomatic inquiries across 3 continents and resulted in numerous additional prosecutions. The scope of the conspiracy had necessitated unprecedented cooperation between international law enforcement agencies, establishing precedents that would influence future investigations involving transnational financial crime. Holmes's methods of evidence correlation across multiple jurisdictions became standard procedure for complex fraud investigations. Personal vindication and restoration. Perhaps most gratifying was Arthur Marsh's complete professional rehabilitation. His testimony regarding the conspiracy's methods had been so precise and comprehensive that several additional prosecutions were initiated based solely upon his evidence. The psychological impact of his captivity had proven less severe than might have been expected, his banker's training having enabled him to maintain detailed mental records that subsequently proved invaluable to the prosecution. The irony, Holmes observed during one of our quieter discussions, is that the very integrity which made Marsh dangerous to the conspiracy also protected him during his captivity. His captors required his expertise too desperately to risk damaging the source of their specialized knowledge. Methodological insights. As winter deepened and London settled into its familiar rhythms, Holmes often returned to the case's demonstration of detective methodology. The beauty of this investigation, Watson, lay not in brilliant flashes of intuition, but in the relentless application of systematic observation. Every detail, however trivial it might have seemed, contributed to the eventual resolution. I found myself reflecting on the accumulated evidence, the clay upon Lord Chetwynd's boots, the rust stains on his Turkish scimitar, the anachronistic ink on the forged claim ticket. Each element seemed insignificant in isolation, I observed, yet together they formed an unbreakable chain of proof. Precisely, Holmes agreed, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light of intellectual satisfaction. The criminals understood ledgers, currencies, and international exchange to perfection, yet they failed to account for fundamental human qualities: integrity, devotion, and the detective's methodical curiosity. Their very sophistication became their vulnerability, creating more evidence of criminal intent with each elaborate deception. Atmospheric conclusion. As Christmas approached and the fog of a London winter pressed against our windows, the case of the Whispering Willows assumed its place among our most significant adventures. The lessons learned during those November days in Chislehurst continued to inform our approach to criminal investigation. The importance of methodical observation, the value of human insight in interpreting physical evidence, and the eternal truth that integrity, however tested, ultimately triumphs over the most sophisticated forms of villainy. Holmes, ever restless, had already begun examining several new cases that promised fresh challenges for our partnership. Yet as he raised his violin that evening, the melancholy air that floated through our dimly lit room seemed to carry with it the whispered secrets of willows now forever silenced. their mysteries resolved through the patient application of scientific method to human behavior. "The great game continues, Watson," he murmured as the last notes faded into the fog-bound night. Another checkmate delivered to the forces of darkness, another demonstration that truth, pursued with sufficient determination and proper method, will invariably triumph over even the most elaborate criminal deception. The willows of Willowbank House had fallen permanently silent, but their whispered legacy lived on in the chronicles of those singular adventures which it has been my privilege to share with the man I shall ever regard as the supreme master of observation and deduction in our time. In the comfortable familiarity of Baker Street, with the fire crackling cheerfully and the London fog weaving its ancient patterns beyond our windows, we could reflect with deep satisfaction upon another successful demonstration that reason, properly applied, remains humanity's most powerful weapon against the darker currents of criminal enterprise. Thus concluded the case of the Whispering Willows, a mystery that had revealed how modern crime could cloak itself in respectability, and how, even so disguised, it might yet be unveiled by the relentless application of observation, logic, and that curious blend of detachment and compassion which made Sherlock Holmes at once the coldest and most humane of reasoners whom it has ever been my privilege to know.